let's just go ahead and say thank you all for coming to the SmartConnect 21 install and config session. I see that some of you on here are live, and that's great. Thank you for being here. For those of you that are watching this recorded, that's great as well. I'm glad that we're able to do this. So just want to do a quick introduction. I'm Chris Hansen, the SmartConnect product manager. What we're going to be running through on this session is a quick run through of your install, the configuration process with SmartConnect 21 after you run that installation, what that means for you and what the different options are as we're running through it. For those of you that are here live, I recommend using the chat and the questions you can send through to me. I will be checking those as we're going through and trying to respond as we go through the session. If you're watching this on a recording, hopefully you get all your questions answered as we go through. So I'm not going to leave my camera on the entire time, just wanted to say hi to everyone that's here live. One thing I did want to talk about with this session is this is going through a new SmartConnect install and a new SmartConnect configuration. If you're looking for the process to upgrade from SmartConnect 2018 to SmartConnect 21, we've already done that webinar. You can find it on our site. If you're here live and you want to find it, I just put it in the chat to all attendees here. That link will take you to the recording. You get to listen to me talk for a lot longer on that one as I go through the upgrade process for SmartConnect 2018 to SmartConnect 21. But for today, what we're focusing on is a new installation, a new config process, and I'll run through the steps with everyone that is on here. So with that, let's get started. Again, I don't have many slides here. I've got one slide really. I've got my title slide, install and config, and then I've got the Q&A section. So if you're on here hoping for a lot of slides, you're not going to get them, which, yeah, I hope no one's disappointed by that. Instead, we're going to dive right into an environment that I've got created that I can use to run through the installation process. Once again, if you have questions or comments, post them in the question pane. Everyone should have access to that. That's in this session. I won't call you out by name, so you don't have to worry about that. And I will try to go through the questions if I can as we're going through this. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me flip to my environment that I have, and I'm going to make this full screen. So bear with me a moment while I get this kind of sized up to what we'll work with. All right, so we're in one of our sandbox environments. We already have SmartConnect downloaded from our site, so it's ready to go. If we're starting from the very beginning of the install and config process, all you really need to work with SmartConnect 21 is this main installer. So if you grab the latest version from there, you can get this installer. There are two other installers that are separate from this. They're optional. I'll talk about them a bit later. One is a GP add-in, one is the Excel add-in, but those are not required for your base installation. Your base install is going through our main installer here, and we're going to go ahead and fire that up. So I'll talk about prereqs a little bit while I'm on here. I'll talk about a few questions that have already come in through here. One question is, does SmartConnect 21 work with Dynamics GP 2018? Yes. The answer to that is yes. SmartConnect 21 works all the way back, I believe, to GP 2010 for our connectors inside of here. So if you're looking at upgrading GP, or if you want to upgrade SmartConnect and your GP is still on an older version, you can likely do that. Once again, if you're going from a 2018 version of SmartConnect or earlier, definitely recommend taking a look at our upgrade webinar that covers that. For SmartConnect and for the prereqs, we have them all listed out in our main product manual that you can get on the website, the same download page that our SmartConnect software is on, and I can put that link in chat later if anyone's having trouble finding that. It does run through what we need. It does require one of the more latest .NET versions to be installed in place. And again, for the base application, as long as you're on a semi-recent operating system, SmartConnect is going to run fine on here. One thing that has changed with SmartConnect in 21 compared to earlier versions is this is now a 64-bit application. The only thing that really means to you as an end user is if you're working with flat files, if you're pulling data from text or Excel, it's looking for a 64-bit driver for those text files and for those Excel files. So you might have to load a new 64-bit driver. Microsoft has those, and that's the only real thing we found that's different with this version of SmartConnect. Now for the installer itself, you don't have a lot of options to configure on here. A lot of the configuration occurs after you run through the installer. So main thing is just choosing the directory you want to install this to. That's your main choice on this. When you get to the next page and choosing these components, what it's going to let you do is choose which options you want in SmartConnect to be available to the user. This doesn't actually fully install these different options, the client, the service, the API, Windows Service API service. That's done through the config tool. So what we're going to look at in the future, so currently this is what the install screen looks like. What it's going to look like in the near future is we're actually going to take these options off the installer and just put them in place by default, because there's not really any setup being done here. This is just whether or not we show the button on the config tool after this upgrade runs or after the installer runs. So we're going to simplify this down a bit. So you're just picking your directory, and that's the only thing you're doing in the actual installer. So when I run through that, this should not take very long. It's creating the SmartConnect directory where I pointed to, and that's about it at this point. So I'm going to let that run through. Then we're going to go take a look at the actual config tool, because that's where the majority of the work is done. Now, when this completes, one thing that we don't have present in the product yet, but we are going to be changing on another near release coming very soon, is we're going to direct you a bit more what to do after this installer finishes, as right now it's a little unclear, especially if you haven't used SmartConnect 21 before. So when the installer finishes, the very next thing we need to do is go to the config tool, and that's what actually ties it to your product code or your account code, and you tell it where the SmartConnect database and everything is on the back end. So not in this version, but in the near future, we're going to have one that will automatically prompt to launch that config process after the installer completes. So said the installer doesn't take that long. My image seems to be running a little slower today. We'll let this finish up, and then I'll make sure I've got that directory figured out for when that completes, and we'll go pull it from here. So while that's running, oh, never mind, finished up just as I was ready to move on. Let's go take a look at our program files, and we should have our E1 solutions folder. So after the installer completes, the main thing we have to do first off, like I mentioned, again, is the config tool. And this is where the majority of your setup comes in. So if you've worked with previous versions of SmartConnect, you're used to doing the setup in the installer. We've split that out now because it gives us a bit more control over what we let you do. And then you can launch this at a later point without having to run the installer again. Now, when I fire this up, the first time you open it, the screen should be blank if it's a new install, because nothing's been entered in here. And what we're going to do is, this is where you're going to want to plug in your account code when that pops open here, your customer ID, to make sure we can link it to your account. So I'm going to use one of mine that I've got in this image that we use for testing, and I'll drop it in here. When you plug in a valid customer ID and validate that, a couple things are going to happen. One, it goes and checks it against our online systems to make sure that, yes, you are truly registered for the product. And then it's going to pull back the name that it's registered to, and then also it's going to pull back our license type. So this key that I threw in here is a perpetual license. You can also own SmartConnect through a subscription license. It should reflect in here what license type you're using. So that's just for your display purpose, to make sure everything matches up the way you expect it to. Again, if you're doing this as a new install, these options down here, this will be empty. I've got a lot of entries in here from previous installs and different tests that we've been doing. So that's why I've got so many entries in here. Normally yours will be empty, or if you've set this up as SmartConnect lets you install it 3 or 4 separate times, so you can install it to a dev environment, you can install it to a user testing environment, and then one to live or one to production. You might have a couple different entries in here if you've done it in that manner. But let's assume, for the purposes of a new install, new config, that these are empty. It's empty list in here. Or if I've got entries in here, I'm going to be creating a new instance anyway. So normally the first thing you do is click the new instance button. That's going to allow us to go ahead and actually tell this config tool where it should create our database for SmartConnect, what we should name it, and we'll get that all set up initially from here. All right, so we'll create a new instance on this. And this is where, again, a lot of this used to be in the installer. So I need to tell it where we're actually connecting to. I don't remember off the top of my head what my SQL server is called. So it's E1 SQL. I'll enter an account in here. So the user that you use in here, I use SA, and that's a lot of times what we'd recommend. technically doesn't have to be SA, but it does need to be a full SQL account, and it needs to have enough rights to go ahead and create SQL objects, because this is creating the database for SmartConnect. It's creating a SQL user to access that database. So the user you use in this connection details on here needs to have enough rights to go ahead and create those objects as we're running through. The database itself, you get to name the database and the SQL user that's accessing that. So I'm going to go ahead and name it SmartConnect 21. Not 32, we'll do 21, like I said. And I'll put the date on here as well, just so I'm not interfering with any other database I might have in place. And I'll do the same thing for my SmartConnect user. Now, in a real scenario, you probably don't want to name it this specific, just name it SmartConnect 21 or something a little bit more reasonable than this, but you get full control over what you want to do in there. You do get to set the password on that SQL user you're creating. So whatever you enter in here, make sure you save a copy of it so you don't forget that. So I'm going to go ahead and create a password. We'll go through there. And then the final step we get here is this is going to be the first SmartConnect user that you're going to be able to log into SmartConnect with. Now, if you're setting this up and your license type is a subscription rather than a perpetual license, that first user might default in here for you. When you order subscription through the website, you do have to put in an email as you're doing that purchase process, and that can be defaulted in here. For that subscription license, you can use that default, or there's a checkbox to go ahead and say create a new user if you wanted to here. So if the person that ordered SmartConnect isn't the one that's logging in for the first time, you can use this window to create your first user if needed as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add my email in here, and I'll talk a little bit more about users as this is running. I'm going to go ahead and put a password on my account. And we'll go like that. So when I save this, it's going to go ahead and create the SmartConnect database, which I've named this. It's going to create a SQL user named this to access that database. And this email and password will be my user that I log into SmartConnect with for the first time. So I highly recommend if you're doing a new install that you go through, make sure you save this email, this password you have for the first user, because if you don't, then you need to contact us and we need to help figure out what your user is or create a new one. And it becomes a headache, which you can avoid if you just remember this and log in for the first time and then add some other users into your system. Now, I'll save that. We'll run through just for a minute to create all that on the back end. And I do want to talk about our users in SmartConnect just for a moment, because how they work differs a little bit depending on if you're a perpetual license or if you're a subscription license. So if you're a perpetual license like this one, any email and user details you put into here and any users you add through the interface for SmartConnect, those are all just saved locally. So perpetual license, everything is saved locally to that SmartConnect database. It's all maintained directly from that environment. Nothing gets saved anywhere else. If this is a subscription license, we save that any users you create locally, but then those are also shared out to our servers in the cloud, because with our subscription license, we give you access to both on-premise SmartConnect and SmartConnect.com. So what that means is any users you create with your subscription license can be used to log in to SmartConnect.com with at a later point if you wish. So subscription license also gives another checkbox later on when you forget your password that allows us to reset it for you automatically, whereas perpetual, we don't have access to that because all your users are local. Now, I've got a question on here is, can you do a clean new install and import old integrations from prior versions? That is covered in a lot of detail and the link I put in the chat with that upgrade process. The short answer is you cannot export maps from SmartConnect 2018 or earlier and import them to SmartConnect 21. You have to go through an upgrade process, and during the install, there's a checkbox I didn't mark on this webinar that says include the option to run an upgrade from 2018 to SmartConnect 21. That's what you would follow if you wanted to bring over old integrations. So once again, won't go into a huge amount of detail with that on this call, but the link I've shared is an hour-long session going through specifically how to upgrade from earlier versions of SmartConnect up to SmartConnect 21. And one thing I'll point out here is once you're on SmartConnect 21, so if you're on SmartConnect 21, the earliest release version to any of these additional SmartConnect 21 releases in the future, there won't be that big upgrade process that you have to follow. Again, that was kind of a one-time thing. We did it 9 years ago in the past when we moved from inside of GP out to our external SmartConnect application. And we've done it once here where we moved from our old architecture on the back end of SmartConnect 2018 to the new architecture that we're using for SmartConnect 21 and going forward. So that upgrade process was a few extra steps, but we cover it in detail, and it's hopefully just a one-time thing we've had to do here. So going forward, any version of SmartConnect 21, you can easily take off the current version, put the new release on there. There's no extra upgrade steps that are required. Now, I ran through that new instance. We've got this connected to a database now on the back end. If I go open up SQL here and I refresh this, we will see that we've got a new SmartConnect 21 with my data on there. If I open that up, I've got my user. That's going to be storing what all of our config options are on the back end. So any maps we set up, connections are all going to be saved in there. Now from this point, if you wanted to, we could close down the configuration tool and we could actually launch SmartConnect, and that would run and work completely fine. But we have a few extra options in here that I do want to go through, just because we want to cover all our bases for the different settings you can configure within our installer. So first thing first, we do have a SmartConnect config button on here. This doesn't have many settings in here. This is just referring mainly to our different connection settings within SmartConnect. So if you're connecting to SQL or another system, these are the timeout settings that we default to within the application itself. So 15 seconds to establish a connection to our system, and then the timeout for any command we're actually running is 3 minutes on there. Again, these you normally shouldn't have to change. These, we've defaulted them in unless there's a specific reason you're working with our support team or another issue you're troubleshooting. These should normally be left to what they're set at on here. Same thing with the debugging option. I would not recommend turning that on unless you're working with support and trying to troubleshoot a very specific issue that you can't track down through normal means. So that's just the config window. The other two options on here, these are much more useful in terms of one's creating our Windows service. And if you're not familiar with what our Windows service does, that handles all the scheduling within SmartConnect. So if you're scheduling integrations to run, if you're scheduling old log files to be cleaned out periodically, if you're scheduling a process to go ahead and clear out tracking tables for records that have been processed, that is all handled through our Windows service. So if you're using any of those, you will want this installed and running on one machine in your environment. Generally, this gets installed onto a server that's going to be up 100% of the time, because if the machine that this is installed to is down, then it's obviously not running or processing any integrations. Also, we normally recommend only needing one of these Windows services. You throw that on your main server, and that handles all the scheduling that you might need. In rare instances where you're scheduling so many integrations that it can't keep up, or the load is too high on that server, you can go ahead and install this Windows service on additional servers if you want to, but it's definitely not required. We only need one of those to normally handle any of the scheduling that we're doing. So I'll go ahead and create that in a moment so we can see what that looks like. The other thing we can do is create that API service. So this is the SmartConnect web service that handles any real-time events that you may have set up. So it doesn't matter if it's a SQL real-time event, GP, CRM, or CE. Any of those real-time triggers need to be pointed at our SmartConnect web service for them to run. So if you want to use a real-time trigger, we need this in place. Additionally, if you want to use the Excel add-in or Excel templates where you're able to push an integration from Excel, that all runs through our web service as well. So you'd want to have that in place if you're running any of those. Once again, we recommend we install this to a full server. The requirement on here is that that server is running IIS because that's what it exists in once it's installed. So we'll make sure we have that requirement met before we run it, which we do on this particular machine. So that API service, the Windows service, and the actual user interface we installed, those can be installed on separate machines. So you could have a separate machine for a Windows service, separate machine for the web service, separate machines for your user interface. They don't all have to be on the same machine if you don't want to. All right, so I have a couple general questions here that I'll answer before I set one of these, a couple of these up. One is, are users still limited on the number of instances? The answer to that is yes. So I think it's 3 or 4, depending on region, instances that you get with your license. And what that means is you could have 3 or 4 separate SmartConnect databases listed in here, and each one would have their own collection of integrations. The most common use for that, especially from the end customer perspective, is having a development system, testing system, and a production or live system from there. All right, there is a very involved question around the scheduling service. Let me see if I can answer that in general. Appreciate these questions. I'm not sure if that's a question or if you're just making a statement there. Again, won't call you out, but that is, yes, you can, oh, there I see the question. Sorry, the whole thing didn't fit in that. Yes, SmartConnect 21. So the question is fairly long. It's talking about they're actually updating SmartConnect tables directly, specifically the scheduling tables to set the next run date, with the intent of not having maps running on a schedule constantly, but only running when there's data in the data source or staging tables. That process would be the same. Yes, there's still like a run schedule master table. You can still set the next runtime, and it's still going to go ahead and pick that up. And another question here before I move on, is IIS needed if you're not running the Excel add-in? If you're not running, the IIS is required if you're installing the SmartConnect web service. So if you're not using the Excel add-in or you're not using any real-time triggers, then no, you don't need the web service, and as a result, you don't need IIS installed. If you need to use our web service for any reason, the machine you install it to, IIS does have to be set up and running on that. So let's go ahead and actually walk through here. Again, thank you for the questions. I do enjoy them. That makes this type of presentation much more fun and enjoyable. Let's go ahead and set this up. When I get into this window, let me enter in a little bit of data, then I'll talk about it here. All right, when we go through the API service window, this allows us to create the SmartConnect web service. You can rename that if you want. We default that in. You can change the port that it's on. We also default that in. Additionally, these settings can actually be changed in IIS after you've installed it for the first time here. So if you want to change the port to something else after the fact, you can do that through IIS. Doesn't matter too much from that regard. The user that we're running it under, it should be a domain user, should have local admin rights on the machine running it on. What's different with this user compared to earlier versions of SmartConnect, like SmartConnect 2018 and prior, is this user you set up in here no longer has to be added inside of SmartConnect to SmartConnect security. All it is working as now is the account that's actually running the service on the background, whether it's the API service or the Windows service. So we do have a validate credentials button on here to make sure we can connect with that account, make sure it's got enough rights, and validation succeeded for me. Once again, we have the connection and command timeouts. Those are the same as the ones you saw in the SmartConnect config, but these are applying it to our web service. So again, leave those as they are by default, unless you need to change them for a specific troubleshooting or debugging purpose. Same thing with that checkbox on here. So I'm gonna go ahead and save that. It will go ahead and create the needed service and everything. I will double check that in IIS, just so I'm showing everybody on here what it looks like if you want to confirm all these components are in place after you run through the install. So the final one is I'll create the Windows service as well. So I'll open this up. This window is going to change a little bit. It looks a bit more complicated, but a lot of these settings you're never touching the majority of time. So I'll go through the top area again here and we'll get this set up and then I'll talk about everything. I use my, again, a domain account with local admin rights on here, make sure that works successfully. So again, all these top options are the same as the web service window, just making sure we have the correct credentials. There are a lot more settings down here below. These are going to be hidden in the future under an advanced settings tab, so they're not visible by default, because once again, you should normally be leaving these as they are. These interact with our Windows service on how they schedule maps, how often it clears out any maps that may have been locked inside of here. But generally, you want to leave these alone, again, unless you're working with our support team or one of the partners that has recommended changing one of these for, again, testing something out or troubleshooting a very specific issue. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and save this. This takes this particular image a little bit longer to create, so it's going to sit here and spin for a little bit. So while it's creating that Windows service and starting it up, there's another question on here is, can we convert an SCE file so you can import it to SmartConnect 21? This relates back to the earlier questions on, can we export from SmartConnect 2018 and import to SmartConnect 21? There's not a way to do that right now. You do have to run through the actual upgrade process that we've included to move from 2018 up to SmartConnect 21. Once you're on SmartConnect 21, you can export and import maps from one deployment to another, as long as they're both on a version of SmartConnect 21, and we'll support that. So while this is still spinning and creating there, I said this particular one takes a bit. Let's go check and make sure some of our other components that we installed are actually in place. So if you installed the web service, what you're going to check on here is the IIS. You're going to check the sites on here. So your website that you have, that should match the name of whatever you set the name to be in that API service window in the installer. So again, I just left it SmartConnect WCF. One thing I do want to point out, and again, especially for those of you that have used SmartConnect for a while, is in a future build this summer, we're actually going to be including a new web service with SmartConnect. So this current one is going to remain in place for quite a while, but we're loading up a new improved REST web service with SmartConnect for use in the future. That's going to support full OAuth authentication. It's going to support full JSON for sending data to and from it. And again, for anyone on the call that's a bit more on the techie side, this is something that's been a long time coming that we're going to use to hopefully improve how developers can interact with our web service, both for SmartConnect 21 and for SmartConnect.com. So in the future, running through here, we'll end up, our service has installed, we'll end up having a couple options here, installing the classic API service and then installing the new one that we've been working on. We're not going to get rid of this current one anytime soon. If you guys remember from early versions of SmartConnect, we had an old SOAP web service for years and years and years, even after we built this WCF one. So once again, we're just taking that next step to generate a new one while we leave the current one in place. But if you find the site in here, you can test this out quick by browsing to the main extension on here. So that should open up a browser for me. Oh, that one's not going to work. I lied. I apologize. Let's go to the content view on here and actually try to browse to this one, the smartconnect.svc. So if you browse to the correct option on here, what you should see is this page. If you see that, that means the web service is responding and it's running. If you get something else than that when you're trying to browse to .svc, then you have to troubleshoot a bit and figure out what is wrong with either the permissions of the user that's running it, or if all the components aren't quite loaded that it requires on the back end around IIS. There's a question on here is, can the web service be installed on a secure site? And the answer is yes, you can easily do that. You can either do that by having the port configured in IIS and through your firewall initially to be SSL, or you can do that after the fact if you want to go ahead and change the bindings on the service. So I can go ahead and take a look at my bindings I have on here, and this works like any other web service in IIS. I could add a new binding, put it on a secure port, and it's going to work just fine as long as you have the correct certificates for your SSL port. All right. The other component that I installed, and I apologize if I go into too much detail on parts of this, but these are kind of like the general things I double check after I run through an installation to make sure it's running. And for any questions that are coming in, I want to make sure everyone that's on here live gets their questions answered with regards to the install process. So we did the Windows service and the API service. We'll go double check to make sure that's running. One other thing I wanted to point out on here is if you're installing SmartConnect into an environment that runs through a proxy, you do need to configure these proxy settings before it's going to validate successfully through your proxy on here. I personally do not have a massive amount of experience around proxies. our support team has definitely helped people configure this as needed. And again, if you have it set up in your environment, you should have an admin that knows what the settings are to connect to that proxy, route it through there, so our configuration tool can validate your key against our E1 servers. All right, so our config ran, I did the Windows service. I'm gonna close this down because that was the final step on here. I installed everything. We've got the user interface, we did the Windows service and the web service. So I'm gonna close this down and I'm gonna go double check to make sure our Windows service appears in the list when I refresh it here. And what you should see on here is, you can see down here is the E1 SmartConnect service that should be running. For the most part, if this ran from your config process and is up and running, you shouldn't have to change anything on here at all. The one thing that I do occasionally change on here is to do an automatic delayed start if needed, especially if you have SQL Server on the same machine. If your SQL Server that is hosting the SmartConnect database is on the same machine as the service, the delayed start will just help ensure that the service doesn't try to fire up until after SQL is up and fully running, to make sure that service can communicate with the SQL Server and as a result with your SmartConnect database. If it can do that, then you should be good to go. So as long as we have that there and running, our IIS site, our SmartConnect site is running as well. Final thing we will do is fire up our SmartConnect interface here and make sure we can log in with that initial user that I configured. So on this login screen, this screen will look mostly the same if you're on perpetual or subscription. The one thing that's going to change slightly is if you have a subscription license, is there will be a box on or a label on here that says forgot password. So if you forgot your password and it's a subscription license, because I mentioned we store your user details on our servers as well for subscription, you can actually use that forgot password link to go ahead and have it reset through our servers, and you'll get an email back to this email saying, hey, click this link, go through the reset password process, and it'll reset it for you. If you're a perpetual license, we don't have that box because we don't know what your users are. Everything's stored locally. So in that case, you'd have to find another user that has rights to your instance, log in with them, and have them reset your password within the UI here. All right, so that should be my password. That'll get me logged in. There is a question in chat, is Barry's had to install eConnect when installing SmartConnect. Is that still true? You need to have eConnect installed if you intend to use Dynamics GP as a destination. So if you're using GP as your destination, you need to have that eConnect runtime service installed on any machine you've installed SmartConnect to. So that is something that is GP specific. So if you don't plan to use GP, or if you're using it only as a data source, you don't need eConnect. If you are sending data into GP, then yes, you still need to install eConnect and configure that through the Microsoft installer. We no longer bundle the eConnect installer into our SmartConnect installation process. So while this is logging in, talking about installers, a couple other things that we had on here. One is this SmartConnect GP add-in. What this does is, if you're using GP with SmartConnect, this GP add-in contains the dictionary that's going to be loaded into your GP client. What that is used for is if you're using the GP connector as a data source. So if you intend to use bulk GP, the GP change data source, or GP real-time, it is required that you run this installer and load that dictionary on any of your GP client machines to get that dictionary loaded, so we can have a reference to those dexterity objects and the field names, and we can actually track any of those triggers that are firing for our GP change and real-time triggers. So that GP add-in is only, once again, it's only required for GP sources if you're intending to pull GP out, data out through GP using that GP connector. The other option we have is our Excel add-in. So we have a 32 and 64-bit Excel add-in that can be installed to any workstation that's got an Excel loaded on it. And then you can set up your users and configure them to run integrations from Excel to any destination you have configured. So whether that's GP, SQL, CRM, Salesforce, Business Central, doesn't matter. The idea of it is it lets the users run integrations directly from their Excel workbook, and that sends that through to your integrations destination. So to use that Excel add-in, that does require our web service is installed and in place running somewhere, and that's what would allow that to function. All right, so our SmartConnect client fired up. The very first thing that it's going to ask us to do is run system maintenance on a brand new install. This is going to run very quick because there's nothing that's been configured. If you are upgrading from a version of earlier version of SmartConnect 21 to the latest one, what that looks like is taking off the current, uninstalling the current SmartConnect UI and uninstalling any current components, running the new SmartConnect 21 installer, and then you just point that config tool to that existing database. And the first time you launch it, it's going to say maintenance needs to run just like this, except it's going to take more than 10 seconds to run. It's going to take, 30 seconds, minute, 2 minutes, depending on how many connections and how many integrations you have in place, just ensuring all the tables are updated to the latest version when working with SmartConnect 21. So once that is complete, we're actually good to go in the interface, and we're kind of approaching the end of what the topics we're going to be covered for the install config process for this webinar. Couple of things I wanted to point out. One very key one, again, is security. After you do that installation, you launch in here, that user you put in the installer, when we made that instance, that's the only user in here currently, especially if it's a new install. You're going to want to add additional users into here, set them up with their email, the password you want them to log in with, to make sure you've got more than one user that's got permission to get into the application. So that's probably the biggest thing I would recommend people do after they get into the application, is make sure you've got multiple people that can access it. Once you make sure you've got enough people in here through security, you've got 2 or 3, so it's not just one person that could be a point of failure, you can look at doing the rest of the SmartConnect setup. We can go ahead and create our connections that we need. Once you create your connections, build our data sources, build our integrations out, and then we're fully using the product. So with that being said, that is kind of the end of my scheduled topics here for this particular webinar. So if there's any additional questions that were around the install, the configuration I went through, any other questions that are even slightly related, feel free to throw them in now. As I expected the session to go about 30 minutes, we went a little bit over that, but I believe that we had this blocked out for a full hour. So if there's any other questions, throw them in. I'll wait a couple minutes as we wrap up here. I can even go ahead and throw up my handy Q&A slide as we're waiting on this. Otherwise, once again, what I want to say is thank you to everyone that showed up live. Thank you for the questions. It's always great doing a session like this and being able to interact with everyone on here. I do have a question on, is there going to be a recording of this that we can go back and review? Yes, there will be a recording for this that gets published. I am not 100% sure on if that automatically gets emailed out to everyone that attended here. I believe it does, but I will double check on that for you. I believe it does. But yes, there will definitely be a recording, just like a recording of that 2018 to 21 webinar that we had. All right, can you add users from the database directly for the perpetual license, or do we need to go to E1 if access isn't available? So the only trick, if you, so let me preface this with a disclaimer. One, we normally don't recommend updating the database directly at all. That's not technically supported. I need to say that, otherwise my support team is going to get very angry at me, and that's why they don't allow me on calls very often. What you can do if you have a perpetual license is you can look in the database to see what users are listed in that user table. The difficulty that you're going to have is that the password fields in there, we do encrypt everything in place. So you can't just directly hand key in what you'd expect your password to be directly in that database. So I know the support team does have a tool that they can use to go ahead and kind of update that user table through there. So I would definitely recommend contacting E1 support if you can't get access for a particular reason on there. And I will forward that by saying, or we'll add to that by saying, if you're using a subscription license, you definitely don't want to touch that user table at all, because we keep that synced up with the options online, or the users online. So if you mess with them in on-premise and they get desynced from online, we're going to cause other issues. So definitely don't recommend updating any tables if it's a subscription license. All right, got a couple more serious questions. Got a fun question. How's the weather in Fargo? Fargo actually has beautiful weather the last 3 or so weeks. We've been mid-70s. It's 80s today. It looks like it's gonna be mid 80s for the next couple of weeks. So we're not too hot, not too cold. It's awesome weather here right now. If anyone ever wants to visit Fargo, I definitely recommend doing it in the June, July timeframe versus January, February. So that's my recommendation on that. All right, what's the time frame for the next improved installer? I don't have a solid answer for you on that. I would say less than 2 months, within 2 months for that. Again, the main changes to the installer is we're just taking away some of those options that don't really serve a purpose. We're just streamlining it down to run through the installer. You pick your directory and it automatically launches the config for you after the fact if you want it to. So there's not going to be any massively improved features in there. We're just trying to make it a little bit easier for users to know where to go. If you watch this video, which you're still here with me, so you have, so that is, you should be fine with the current one. Question on the end of life for SmartConnect 2018. End of life for support is officially end of this year, so end of December of 2022 here. That being said, we won't leave anyone just out hanging out to dry. So we'll still try to help you out, but the official end of life date here is the end of the year for SmartConnect 2018. Already for the last 6 or 7 months or so, we haven't done any updates to SmartConnect 2018. So all current new development, bug fixes, features, those are all going into SmartConnect 21 and into the newer versions of SmartConnect 21 going forward. So as we're moving forward this year and in the next year, all the new features that we'll be talking about on partner calls, customer calls, everything that we're adding to product, that's all SmartConnect 21, which is one of the major reasons for moving up to SmartConnect 21 is everything we're adding into it is going to be in place and updated on the latest versions we're using versus 2018. All right. I've got some specific licensing question that's coming in here. Perpetual registration is expired. Do you have to renew to be able to upgrade? Yes. So if you're upgrading to SmartConnect 21, you do have to have a current license with SmartConnect, either perpetual, making sure it's renewed, or subscription, making sure you're in place on that. I would recommend talking to either your partner or your E1 account rep on what your options are around that, because I know there's different promotions going on depending on what license you're using and where you're at with the product currently. But yes, to use 21, you do have to have a current license for that. All right. So it looks like questions are winding down. I will let everyone go. Once again, thank you for attending the session here. Recording will be available. I believe it only takes about a day or so normally to go ahead and have that recording up and running. So we'll get that out to everyone that was on here, anyone that was registered that didn't get to attend, and then we'll have the link available in the future for anyone that missed this. So once again, thank you all for attending. Thanks for the great questions. Hope everyone has a great day. We'll see you.